This is the e-learning podcast, episode number 43.
For the conversations again I'm having, which are very vulnerable, often really honest. Strangely enough, I feel like people feel a sense of safety on a screen or in a chat. And so they can ask certain things and feel a sense of community that they may have not been able to access in the physical world, ironically.
Welcome to the e-learning podcast from lmspulse.com. My name's Stephen Laddick, and I'm the director at LMS Pulse. After a series of fundamental shifts in her personal and professional life, including a thwarted promising career as an opera singer, my guest for today, Jennifer Brown, had no choice but to reinvent herself. In the process, she noticed how other parts of our world are ripe for transformation, including corporate learning and the diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI space. Jennifer is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting and the author of the books Inclusion in 2016 and How to Be an Inclusive Leader in 2019. She is a super dynamic speaker, and her depth of passion and knowledge around diversity is unparalleled in my experience. As a vocal member and advocate of the LGBTQ plus community, Jennifer envisions a radically transformed organization in the way it embraces people's voices, feelings, and passions. And in our new normal of digital connections amid our collective sense of uncertainty and threats to our well-being, she could not be more thrilled about the prospects for more attentive, inclusive, and just human leadership styles. In this really intimate conversation, Jennifer and I talk about why she is adamant about bringing your full self into your organization or team, as opposed to being fearful of showing who you are in the workplace. We also talk about the things that get in the way of organizational culture and how DEI can often be a powerful way to address those things. We talk about why even privileged leaders can benefit from more open ways to communicate and collaborate, that, among other things, lets everyone know that it's okay to share and feel vulnerable. We also talk about how you can reinvent as a person, a professional, or as an educator without losing your identity, but actually evolving it, and why crises are often fantastic catalyzers for personal growth. And then finally, we talk about the value of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which for Jennifer is an ideal state for a learner and as an educator when it comes to the topics of diversity and privilege, as well as pretty much any other subject. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The e-learning podcast is sponsored by the e-learning Success Summit. Learn from more than 40 experts how to teach, work, and learn online without being overwhelmed. Get your free ticket to the summit at elearningsuccesssummit.com. And lmspulse.com, your best source for news, information, and resources for e-learning professionals for more than 10 years. Get our free roundup of the week's top news at lmspulse.com.
Hello, Jennifer. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Stephen, thanks for having me.
Jennifer, we're recording this at, not the top of 2021, but, we're right in the middle of January here, 2021. Tell me about where do we find you sitting today?
I am in New York City. I have been here for the duration, she says proudly. There's a certain badge of honor for those of us that, truthfully didn't have anywhere to go. However, it's been just a ride, as you can imagine. I live right in the hotbed of Union Square, Washington Square, right, which is where, historically for hundreds of years, people have come to protest and use their voice. And so it's just been really intense, but amazing to be here too in such a tough city, right? Such a resilient city. And given what I do for work, to be around that conversation directly in that way has been just an opportunity of a lifetime.
Fantastic. Take me a little further there. Something I'm asking everyone on the podcast, just how's your COVID been? I mean, what, either you personally, how's it affected you? How's it affected your work and your practice, or, those around you, however you want to answer that question, but where do things stand right now? And what's that look like?
Yeah. It just grounded me. Metaphorically speaking, very true also, but literally, like all of us who travel for a living, and I'm a keynote speaker, so I'm constantly at conferences and client events, and just to have all that stop in March and then have starting to deliver online many sort of times a day even has meant a shift for us, but I actually have really enjoyed it. It's not just being able to be in PJs from the waist down and bunny slippers, but no, I think it's added to the ability to have greater reach. You just realize the constraints of the way we used to do business. And I think we will never go back because we've discovered this whole other sort of more scalable way to reach people. And then for the conversations, again, I'm having, which are very vulnerable, often really honest, strangely enough, I feel like people feel a sense of safety on a screen or in a chat. And so they can ask certain things and feel a sense of community that they may have not been able to access in the physical world, ironically, because of, again, the reach of the interwebs. So yeah, it's been incredible. It's accelerated a lot of things. And probably a lot of us as business owners say we were hesitating to try this new technology or do this delivery mechanism, but we were already on that road, but it's definitely accelerated not just us, but the way our clients think work has to happen versus how it can really happen and how it really can be delivered. And by the way, faster, cheaper, more efficiently. So literally our capacity and our capability has accelerated, which is super cool. So we are busier than ever. The topic we focus on, of course, is super duper on fire and continues to be into 2021, which is really exciting that it's not something that was a moment in time, but really was a fundamental shift that's here to stay.
So you almost told us what it was. But you are a diversity and inclusion expert. You've already told you are a keynote speaker. You are an expert out there. You've got a best-selling book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. Just give us a little bit more about who Jennifer Brown is, what your practice is, and what you normally deliver as your profession, and then we'll kind of dive into the weeds from there.
Yeah, sure thing. Yes. So I am indeed in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world. We call it DEI for short, but there's also other names out there. The word belonging you may hear around as well. We study organizational culture. We think about what would create cultures of belonging where everyone can thrive, and fundamentally what gets in the way of that thriving. And often what gets in the way of it, based on our research and everybody else's, is identity. Stigmas related to identity, choices we make about kind of not bringing our full self to work because of the fear of stigma and stereotypes that so many of us engage in around both our visible, diverse characteristics, perhaps, or many, many invisible ones as well. So, the bottom line is that the bottom line is impacted, right? When we have legions of people who are struggling with psychological safety and microaggressions on a daily basis in an organization full of unconscious bias or conscious bias, we are literally leaking out productivity, potential, amazing talent. Like people just can't perform at their best. And so it's a total waste of human potential and it's a drag on the bottom line. So that's literally where we live. And it was my story too, because I found my voice in a really interesting way. I was an opera singer and I came to New York and I studied opera and vocal performance, and I got a master's from Manhattan School of Music. And my plan was to be on Broadway and be what we call a legit soprano, which means that I'm an operatically trained stage soprano that can be in musicals. And that's sort of the shorthand on that. And I dance.
How do you put that on a resume? I don't know.
I know.
Sorry.
No, but believe it or not, there is a niche for that.
Yeah, sure.
And I also dance and the whole thing. But then I ended up hurting my voice and I got vocal surgery to fix that. And I had to have that several times. So I knew I had to reinvent. And I tell this story all the time. So apologies for people that already know it. But stage performers we're agile, we're flexible, we're resilient, we're cats, we land on our feet. So I landed on my feet. And I found and discovered this field of leadership and organizational development. And I just fell in love with it. I thought, this is so important. It's sort of the human side of business. It's something I could really sink my teeth into and my heart into. And also I identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So you talk about not bringing your full self to your work, right? So as a performing soprano looking this way, I was always cast as the 18-year-old love interest.
Sure. Yeah.
And then, and meanwhile, having this whole other truth of my life and who I love and the fear of casting directors, learning that. So it was really terrifying to kind of imagine, how is my career going to play out with this? At some point, how will the world reconcile with this? And this was 20 years ago, or a little more than that. So, different times, right? I actually would argue it's kind of the same times. I mean, that some of these worlds are very old school and they're very slow to change, and around LGBTQ plus characters and also actors and performers playing different kinds of roles and being out about who they are. And so there's this like slow progress on that front. So then as an entrepreneur, though, I would subsequently kind of really find my voice and realize that my differences are such a powerful toolkit from which to teach and from which to facilitate, and that it would actually make me stronger as a practitioner and also give me credibility because I have sort of a foot in marginalized identities. And so having experienced that, but I also have many feet, if it's possible to have more than one foot, many appendages in the world of privilege, based on how I was raised, my skin color, my educational background. I have 2 master's degrees. I never went hungry. I didn't have violence in my home. I don't have a hidden disability. They just go on and on and on about the things that I think of them as tailwinds that are speeding me along in whatever I endeavor in this world. And not that I don't work hard. I work really hard, but it doesn't have to do with that. It's really the way the world looks at you, the way the world regards you, and it does not do so in an equitable way. And so I utilize these days, I use the privileges or the access that I have, and I get into rooms and I shake things up and I tell the truth, and I teach in a way, or I challenge people, especially executives, which is what I spend most of my time on, because I can be listened to, because people make assumptions that they are somehow maybe more comfortable with me because of what they see. And then I choose sometimes to come out and say, oh, by the way, I'm also LGBTQ. And were you aware of that? Did your biases and your lens prevent you from even considering that might be true about me? So right away, I'm able to kind of neutralize impressions and then kind of direct learners that I work with in the right direction. And then we can get down to work and do some really good stuff. So, my whole life, I always say, like, all these things didn't happen as accidents, losing my voice, having to get surgery, having to find another career. All of it might have felt like heartbreak at the time, and certainly did. But I believe these things redirect us in life in a way that we need to be redirected. And I never would have discovered what I do now if that hadn't happened. And it's such a gift. It's so profound. So anyway, yeah, that's a good life lesson, isn't it?
I love it. And ultimately at the end of the day, it comes down to perspective and reframing, right? It's how do you choose to look at the situation and what it offers to you? Is this a defeat or is this an opportunity, right? Speaking of opportunities, you have a book. In your book, it's called How to Be an Inclusive Leader. You talk about why it's important to, rather than what may be leadership in a typical corporation, in our cases, institutions of higher education or learning and development departments in these big corporations, a lot of times we hear, hey, don't bring yourself to work. You're here to work, keep your personal stuff at home. Right. But you're making the argument that bringing your full self, you say your full self or your whole self, bring to work. You're saying that's actually the right move. Tell me about that.
Well, and 2020, I think, put a lot of pressure on us to do exactly that. But we have been talking about it for a long time in our field. But it was hard to kind of get on the radar screen of decision makers that this was indeed extremely important, and that our concept of, I guess, what leadership looks like. And I mean leadership at all levels. I'm not just talking about people with direct reports. We all lead, whenever we are in colleagueship with others, we have an opportunity to lead with a small L. But yeah, so I think the 2020 showed us that the old style of leadership is not enough because it doesn't include empathy to the extent that it should. I mean, and I'm broadly generalizing here, but it traditionally has been command and control, having all the answers, never admitting vulnerability or uncertainty. A lot of the hallmarks that worked, I guess, in a more certain world. However, when the deck of cards gets thrown up in the air like it did in 2020, and we're not sure it's ever going to come back together into a nice, neat deck, The best leaders are agile, flexible, responsive, know how to resonate, know how to win trust across difference, and are very comfortable and competent in that conversation. And all of a sudden, I think a lot of leaders woke up, particularly of certain identities, right, that I share some of, and said to themselves, wow, like as Marshall Goldsmith says, what got me here won't get me there.
Right.
Like I'm going to have to just do a wholesale kind of revisiting of how I've looked at performance, how I've looked at accountability, how I've looked at seeing the whole person and not like sweeping things under the rug because I'm uncomfortable with them and I don't want to deal with them. When now 2020 showed us the pervasiveness of things like mental health issues, the pervasiveness of the difficulty of being Black in a Black and brown in a corporate environment that wasn't built by and for people that look like you. Like all of that has been now shown to us. And it's one of many gifts of 2020 is the truth has been told, you know, in a way. I've been trying to shout the truth. However, it's been really difficult to get the attention and let alone then the appetite to say, we cannot let this happen pre-2020, you know, to find the unusual company and leader who, upon seeing like the data, says, I don't want people to struggle to work here. I don't want them to feel that every day is a battle. Unfortunately, those kinds of leaders were in short supply. I think now we have a lot more to work with and they are, you know, fearful, scared, hesitant, feeling extremely vulnerable because it is a completely absent skill set. It is something that we have not taken seriously in the leadership toolkit at all. We haven't invested in it. With diversity, equity, inclusion, we've actually jobbed it out. We've outsourced it to our diversity team.
Sure.
We've also outsourced it to the women and the people of color and the LGBTQ people in our organization, thinking they were going to carry the water for change. When, by the way, newsflash, they don't have actually the positional power where they are in organizations because of all the things we've been talking about to actually own change. Like it's not realistic. It's not located in the right place. And so these days I'm really fired up about where is the responsibility for change located? It's located amongst those that have positional power and can like literally sign something or commit to something and have it be so. And do that quickly. So shortcutting the years and years of labor that a lot of us have been putting in to make our organizations better from the bottom up, that's great. And that is so important and has never been appreciated to the extent that it should. However, I'm really interested in engaging a whole group of people that have traditionally said, this is not my issue. It's not on my to-do list. It's not important for me. Or I know nothing about this because of my lived experience, right? I'm, you know, and you know, if I had a nickel for every executive that says, Jennifer, I have every privilege in the world, I don't know how to lead on this. And I love that question. I love it. I can do a lot with that because there's a lot of things we can do. We just haven't, this is not a conversation that we've had.
I'd love to hear how you do answer that because I'm just thinking in corporations, in the schools and whatnot, the people that we speak with, you know, oftentimes, hey, you hear the term, hey, we're KPI driven, you know, show me, you know, I have a responsibility to move this, you know, part of the corporation. And I'm responding to shareholders, right? You know, that I would assume, having not been in these conversations, I would assume that would be a typical response you'd get. And so I care, I'm empathetic. Yeah, I'd love to see this happen, but really my responsibility is this set of data or whatever, or outcomes. Where does that conversation go? Like where, you know, let me stop there. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yes, it is the, what gets measured gets done, which is the, you know, prevailing wisdom. So let's measure it. You know, the most progressive organizations I know measure not just diversity, which is the WHO, right? So that's the demographics. And by the way, if you aren't measuring that and holding people accountable for that, you know, that's coming, whether that's, you know, your present reality or soon to be, it's going to be something that needs to be measured. And I predict will be measured because our institutions have to look like the external world that we do the work in. They have to look like our stakeholders. They have to look like our students. Our faculty needs to reflect the diversity of our students.
Right.
Our administration needs to reflect that, right? In the corporate world, we have a complete lack of non-white, non-male, non-cisgender leaders at the executive level. I mean, it's truly shocking when you look at the numbers. And, I encourage anybody who doesn't know the statistics I'm talking about to definitely check it out.
Okay.
But there is no way that kind of leadership team makeup can see around the corner, can anticipate what's coming next, can, by the way, deal with the rolling social justice crises, like rolling. This is not, 2020 was not an aberration. You will need the capability to respond quickly and I think correctly to the moment. Your young people in your institution expect you to be good at this. And you can't be good at it if you don't have diversity around the table being listened to and consulted to say, how do we respond? How can we prepare ourselves to respond?
So if I could right there, like, I feel like there's a real great moment right there.
Yeah.
Because I love where you're going with it. And the first thing that I'm terrified as, hey, you're looking at me. I am a 40-something white man, right? As a leader in these organizations, these institutions, I don't want to get canceled.
I know.
I don't want to make the mistake in a meeting or a town hall or a whatever, where all of a sudden I've just, okay, whoops, I said the wrong thing. And then, or I tried, I made an attempt. Right. And so one of the things that you talk about, I'm really interested in hearing your advice here, is how do I use this voice that I have, or how do I use this position to actually start to take action? But then, sort of, do I ask the audience for, hey, I'm going to stumble here, or hey, I'm going to screw this up probably a couple of times, help me to do that. Like, am I answering my own question here, or what?
You kind of are. Yeah, that would have been one piece. I think, back to our question of what we talked about with leadership changing, right? The definition of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, not having the answers and talking about not having the answers, talking about your identity, even if it's one that is not talked about. Like until very recently, saying the words white and black was not okay. I mean, I used to have to take white out of my presentations until, several years ago. So I think naming our lack of lived experience and our deficits, doing so publicly, almost inoculates us in a way. And I think is part of the learning and the muscle that we need to build, which is I'm not going to fake it like I know, because there's no way I can know. However, what is most, I think, fairly judged would be that I am endeavoring to stretch. I am on my learning journey. Here's how I'm undertaking this. Here's where I'm going to stumble. Here's what I don't yet know. Here's what I am feeling awkward about. Here's the support that I would benefit from if at all it can be given. Sort of welcoming of that feedback, the seeking of the feedback. It's not just like, oh, I accept your feedback, my door is open. It's very much like you need to push into this moment and push into the conversations and think about, like, how often am I in an uncomfortable place where I'm unfamiliar with the discussion going on, with the identities that are having voice, and how often can I put myself in those positions so that I can start to sensitize myself to what it feels like to, walk around in the same exact environment, but have a totally different experience. And so, if people listening to this have affinity groups at your organization, sign up for every single one, and when you are invited, when it's open to allies of a certain community, which means that you don't have the specific identity represented in the affinity group. And I say this because sometimes there's closed meetings just for the identity. And then other times it's sort of open to all. So respecting that, the more you can put yourself in those positions, the more you will listen and absorb and understand language and terminology and develop empathy. And also develop the lenses that aren't your own. Because leadership, I've always said, it's really about the recipient. It's not about what I intend or how I define things or what I think success looks like. It's literally trying to see the world through others' eyes, see the value proposition of working at a certain place through their eyes. Like, what would be the value proposition, and how can I be a part of removing obstacles for others in this institution? And what can I challenge to remove those obstacles? And when people say, I don't know what I can do, what I'd say is, so first we just said, admit what I don't know, talk about it often,
Right.
and then activate different kinds of privilege that we have, which goes far beyond white privilege and male privilege, right? Those are the two things we kind of hear and unfortunately have been kind of weaponized, which I don't think is terribly helpful and actually destructive. But I think what we can be talking about is like, what do I have access to, comfort with, who's in my network? How can I champion people who, aren't championed? How do I add my capital with a small c, right? Social capital, professional capital, reputational capital. How can I join whatever access and power I have really with those that deserve to be, pulled up and supported? Because think about it, we've been doing that for people that look like us since the beginning of the modern workplace. I've been letting a family member know about a job opening, and then I've like joined my capital with that person, or they went to my school, so therefore I put in a good word for them. I mean, this is not new. The question to me is, though, how can we be more strategic from an equity lens? How can we really not take our power for granted and activate around it every single day in a million ways to change the sort of trajectory and the ease of the path for others? Because I can tell you, the path has been difficult. Ask any woman who's achieved the executive ranks about the sacrifices that she's made.
Sure.
Ask any person of color who's the only person of color at their level, the only one left standing effectively, and say, like, how have you experienced covering your identity, minimizing your cultural identity, modifying the way what you talk about, or the way that the mannerisms and the way you speak and the way you dress. I mean, there's just so many stories about the double work that a lot of us do. And I don't think any leader worth their salt should be happy with this. Like, when you are shown that this is true, how does that not impact performance? How does that not impact your accountabilities, your KPIs? When somebody is not feeling psychologically safe, they are not able to create at their best. There's no, when you're managing, oh my goodness, like, when's the next microaggression going to hit me? And how is that going to make me feel diminished and small? And sort of remind me of my identities that aren't represented here. And then, by the way, we need you to also be brilliant and bring your best ideas and like feel that like sense of trust that the best teams have, right, to create together. So it's an impossible equation. And so I just wish I saw leaders that were more invested in digging into what I'm talking about and taking ownership for changing it, and using whatever we have within our toolkit to shift that, and however that looks. So I'll just put that there, that I think just don't, and you said the calling out, the cancel culture. My answer to that is yes, admit your, the things we don't do well. That's important to sort of inoculate and sort of level set, I think, the conversation, so that people don't expect it to be,
Right.
and you open the door to feedback. But I think your institution has to also, we've got to have each other's backs and commit to a learning culture where we can fail forward and extend the grace to each other to do that, right? When have we ever had to learn something and done it perfectly the first 3 or 4 times? Like, when did that become the standard for developing a new skill set or a new product or, a new innovation, right? It's not. And yet when it comes to
the
this
answer is
topic,
never, incidentally.
never. Yeah, exactly. So you learn from the failures, and yet with this work, we expect everybody to show up perfectly the first time. And I don't think it's fair. So those of us who cancel others, I would say that the better alternative is to call in, and the call in is an opportunity for a conversation, is an opportunity for feedback.
Ooh, I like that.
And it extends compassion to people. And when we get on our high horse and cancel, I would ask that person, what have you done imperfectly as you were learning about a new identity or your own allyship? There's so many opportunities and for all of us to get things wrong constantly. And the learning never stops. And so I think just be careful. Like, when you do the scorched earth, think about that scorched earth for yourself. Like, is that the way that we want to play? I think it causes a ton of destruction and mayhem and breaks trust. And also, worst of all, thwarts potential allies on their learning journey to the point where these folks could be the biggest champions. If we can figure out how to hold the space for our own growth, we will get there faster, and not through the sort of battle of cancel culture, but we'll get there through the sheer desire to grow, in our humanity, in our compassion, in our vocabulary, in our empathy, in our lenses. All that is just an incredible space to hold for each other. So, I do think institutions have to figure out, like, what are we going to level set as the learning process? Like, what is okay and what's not okay that still makes space for failing forward. This is by the way, the growth mindset. I'm sure Carol Dweck's work, but it's such a critical thing to progress. So I want the chance to fall off my bike a bunch of times before I figure out how to ride it, and I want the grace and the space from others and the support, not to say, "How dare you fall off that bike?" So you are a horrible person.
So take me to structure. Okay. In that conversation, I absolutely, as someone, as a part of this conversation, someone who's a part of this conversation. Just the grace of being able to, skin my knees a few times, or actually, constantly, we're gonna, I had a great friend, or I have a great friend who always had this great analogy of, he's like, look, like, we're all kind of adolescents, as you're growing, your body's kind of just going crazy and your feet are way too big, you stumble a lot. Right. And so as you're coming into this new conversation, the interesting thing I find really interesting about this conversation is where do you ultimately, at what point do you arrive? You know what I mean?
That's always the question we get.
It's a great question, and maybe not, I don't know, is it a great question? I'm asking it right now, but and I think that is probably something that is held in the back of a lot of people's minds, where it's like, look, I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to make the effort, and I'm willing to be a part of the conversation. At what point do I arrive? But let me attach that to what the question is really. When you're speaking with leaders, talk to me about structure and what sort of moves they can make structurally in organizations, in schools, in colleges and universities and whatnots to crack this code as well. So not only when do I arrive, but like, when does the organization arrive? How can we get there? Is and maybe the answer is we don't have a formula, but is there one? That's what I ask.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you some of the common mistakes with structure. Maybe that helps. Organizations often start with training and think that training is the same as strategy. So it's not. Education and awareness building, and sort of the conversation about behaviors is part of what should be a macro strategy as an institution. So, we tend to piecemeal this work. Or we do the bare minimum, like everybody needs to go through unconscious bias training, and then I check the box and we move on and we get on to the business of the day. And unfortunately, like, that's the level of lack of respect that we've given this work. But my firm actually comes into organizations with no strategy and builds one, which is a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year strategy that orients around workforce goals and objectives and accountabilities, workplace, which speaks to the everyday culture, and then also marketplace. So marketplace is that third pillar, which speaks to customers, right? Product development, sales, all that sort of external facing stuff. And so as a strategy that's properly lined, then all these pieces can be developed within it. And then it becomes accountable to the leadership team, because we also talk a lot about sort of how this has to be driven from the top. Very important. Otherwise, people will view it as a nice to have. And so back to your question about KPIs, then KPIs might follow from that strategy. And then we have leaders holding other leaders accountable, and ultimately all the way to the CEO and the board, or whoever your most accountable executive is in your institution. Really, they have to be your biggest champion ever. They have to be the one who points everyone back to the strategy, right? Includes the strategy and updates on the strategy in every single executive meeting. How are we doing on this? How are we doing on this? What's getting in the way? What do we not understand about this? Why is this not a priority? That is what a real CEO leader sounds like in managing to that strategy, right? And so then everybody realizes like, this is real. This is part of the way we do business. And there's kind of, no escaping it.
Sure.
Look, I'm just a messenger from the future. Like, I just feel like if companies don't want to talk about this, I'm like, good luck. Good luck to you as an individual leader and as an institution. If this is too uncomfortable for you, then literally you are opting out of like your lifeblood in the future, because you will need to be not just competent in this. I mean, that's kind of a baseline. You will have to be enthusiastic, passionate, committed, public about values. This will be something you are expected to have a voice on, to respond quickly to unrest or employee challenges, right? It's sort of our timelines are collapsing, right? And our organizations are flattening, and the accountability is shifting, I think, too. And leaders are sort of caught completely unprepared. And that's what we've seen in 2020. So you asked sort of what is the roadmap or the structure. So the strategy has to be in place. Never mistake training for strategy.
Right.
Remember Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So to me, that speaks to the lived experience of your employees on a day-to-day basis. If it doesn't align with what you say is important to your DEI strategy, then it will bite you. So you've got to have your ear to the ground, constantly collecting information, engendering an environment where people will tell you the truth. One of the most dangerous places for leaders to be is in a vacuum. And we generationally, us Gen Xers and baby boomers are in a vacuum in so many ways. And also identity-wise, if you're white, straight, male, you're in a sort of deficit in terms of lived experience. So unless you are a dedicated student of this and you are of that identity, most of us, our learning curve is incredibly steep. And so you got to become a student of it. Like you just have no choice. I mean, if you want to remain relevant and all that. So and then beyond that, I guess in my book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, I did a 4-part like maturity model, which I think is really helpful for a lot of individuals, right? So I'll just go into that quickly. You when you read it, you ask your question, am I in unaware, which is phase 1, which is, I don't know there's a problem. I don't want to see the problem. I don't want to take ownership of the problem. I'm a good person. Isn't that enough? I have, it's the I have daughters rationale.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Therefore, I'm a champion of gender equity in my organization. Not the same. We're all related to a woman and who's not
in some way. Yeah.
So anyway, but the I'm a good person is speaks to intent versus impact, right? So unaware is that, and then aware is phase 2, which is okay. Oh my gosh, now I know what I don't know. Now I've been shown. Like I have the light bulb moment. I'm reading and consuming media and listening to podcasts and putting myself in conversations that are unfamiliar and uncomfortable. It's an overwhelming awareness. Phase 2 is like a crushing amount of information, particularly for those of us that have grown up literally not really studying the full history of our country in school, and sort of getting the lessons of 2020 and sort of being hit with the reality of our fellow Americans and humans, to say, wow, I didn't know, I want to know, I want to do more. And now I'm realizing sort of the overwhelming amount of information that I need to somehow quickly learn and become comfortable using, which is the tricky part. And these are all like really big leaps. And then from awareness to active, phase 3, what do I do with all the knowledge I learned in phase 2? I need to activate. And activate is, I think you were talking about when I do step out, when I do use my voice and I get it wrong. How resilient am I? Am I like bamboo? Am I going to bend and come back, snap back, right? Weeble wobble. Am I going to not get fragile and overly emotional or dramatic about making mistakes? Am I going to be tough? Am I going to say, you know what, it's not about me? Am I going to try new language and try to always kind of have the latest in my head as I show up? And you asked me earlier in our prep about performative allyship. I know that's a lot of words. Allyship is joining joining your efforts with a marginalized or an underrepresented identity
Right.
when you don't have that identity. So I like to think I aspire to be an ally, considered an ally by communities that aren't my identity. Every day I think about that. And at the same time, I'm an LGBTQ person, so I need my straight allies.
Right.
I'm a cisgender woman, so I need my male allies too. And I need that allyship. And performative simply speaks to the fact that a lot of people have, I suppose, claimed ally without earning it. And so we want to move 2020.
This is the hashtag movement.
Exactly. Yes, it is. It's or the black square on Instagram for Black Lives Matter, right? It's sort of the phoning it in. It's doing as little as possible with the least risk that you can take. So sort of playing it safe. Versus I think allyship and even what we call accomplishing is kind of getting in the water with people, or I heard it referred to as like, I'm in your getaway car and like, I got the engine running, like I'm here, activate me. And I'm not going to wait to be activated. I'm going to be looking for places where I can actually take action and not without being prompted necessarily, which I think is like that's truly where we need to go beyond performative, is to, in every room we're in every decision, in every conversation, we are using our voice, bravely, fearlessly. It doesn't take a woman to be in that room, which we often aren't in that room. It doesn't take the woman in the room to say, hey, that's inappropriate. Because somebody like you's in that room and says, hold on, like, can we just pause right there? That's something that's not inclusive language, or taking somebody aside after a meeting and giving somebody coaching and calling them in, all those wonderful things. So,
by the way, I love that, calling them in rather than calling them out. I think it's
good.
That really, I haven't heard that one before. I really like that one.
You haven't? Oh, yeah.
Personally, I haven't heard that one.
It's not really, I'm thinking about it a lot for my next book. I'm thinking about how could I define call-in culture? Like, what would that actually look like on a day-to-day basis?
I don't know, but I'll tell you what, if you figure out how to do that as a next book, you're going to, for someone like myself, again, who, I am the person, I embody the person who you're speaking to most often, and I just feel like that is not one of the most things that we need to be able to capture. I don't have a great way to say this, but because it reframes this conversation so much, where it's just like, hey, wait a second, let's come in, let's talk about this, rather than calling you out and being like, hey, you just screwed that up or whatever. Like, that is just, it's absolutely massively important.
Massively important. I agree. So yeah. And it's a little bit of an unpopular stance to take, because I think that tensions are running really high. There's a lot of anger. And so sometimes I find myself, feeling, I don't mean to not hold people accountable. Like, that's not my goal, but my goal is to hold space for learning.
I was just going to say that would be, but you've got to go straight to the Gandhis and the MLKs and the whatevers of history, where it's just like, look, you have just what you said. Look, it's not about not being accountable, and it's not about, holding people accountable to things, but it's also saying, look, we have to also operate with grace and loving kindness, and really, like, let's move to those ideals, right? That's really where it is.
I love that. I'm all about that. This is compassionate work. It's about empathy, and that empathy has to extend to each other. It should not be. Kenji Yoshino, somebody I quote a lot, talks about, it's not the pain Olympics. So we can't get like wrapped up in this hierarchy of who's been
in the most pain, who's got the biggest crutch. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Or like even who has the most privilege. Because to me, in the sort of the book of life, what's going to really matter is if I was an amazing ally that was like, and you asked earlier about the destination, like, how do we know we're there yet? Are we there yet, Mom?
Well, you got to remember as well to take us to phase 4 in your book. You only talked about the first 3 phases. What's the 4th phase? Yeah.
Thank you. Good listening. So the 4th phase is advocate. So advocate is different than active, which is phase 3, because I'm actually like, now I'm comfortable. I know how to wield what I have. I know how I'm fearless, I'm brave, I'm courageous. I don't wait for permission. I challenge people that look like me, which is really critical. I'm asking systems questions. And so I think at advocate level, you may be in a leadership position, and you may have the ability and the permission to say, why do we do it this way? How come we haven't fixed this? How could we fix this at the systems level so that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom, but that we're actually getting to the root of why it's happening in the first place? Like that deep work, particularly that can be done, I think, by people with power, is what we need to see a lot more time spent on the calendar in those conversations. And it can be exhausting. I think people at advocate level, I worry about like self-care, because we just push and push and push, right? And we are so committed. And by the way, we can be advocate level around some identities, and then we can be only at aware about other identities. And I want to just point that out too, that like you might be listening to me and say, oh, I'll bet she's advocate level on everything. And I'm not. I am literally in the infancy of my learning on so many different identities that I don't carry. I'm a student of those, and I'm constantly trying to say, like, what do I need to learn? What are the microaggressions faced by these communities? What are the common biases that occur? What is the language, the latest language that this community wants to be addressed with?
Well, and I'm sitting here, as you know, I'm sitting here in Latin America.
Yeah.
And I came from Southeast Asia. And so we don't have time to unpack it in this particular conversation, but I'm just thinking, holy smokes, you know what I mean? Like just even to start those conversations in these cultures where I've been living. Wow. It's a long, there's a long road to hoe, as we say.
Oh, and it's intersectional, which is another favorite word, right? It's cultural identity.
Yeah.
It's America, the way we have our particular history in America, right? And all the conversations happening here are so different than. It's fascinating. I love that the work is endlessly presenting like new lenses.
The way that this continues to unfold, and not only job security for someone like yourself, but again, I want to end this conversation not only by thanking you, because this has been absolutely fascinating, absolutely love it, and it's a conversation that not only needs to happen, but it needs to be something we just talk about on a regular basis, right? But I want to end it kind of where we began, where it's like this isn't something to be afraid of, but it really is an opportunity that is just it's right there. It's on your desk, whoever's listening, for you to sort of grab hold of and make it your own. So
and just I would say start small. I would say get on the journey. Don't judge yourself. Don't be obsessed with the destination. And then I would start small with private work. That reflection, the reading, the analysis of my own biases. Where am I maybe repeating microaggressions? Maybe you get a reverse mentor and you welcome certain people or invite certain people into your inner circle who can give you the truth, like who can react to how you are growing, how you are showing up, what you may not see about yourself in action. But start small, I would say, and start private. So that you develop the muscle before you go public. Because what I really don't want, Stephen, is a bunch of people kind of jumping in and making a mess, causing more harm inadvertently with the best intentions, because they haven't really studied this, and haven't kind of road tested it, I guess. But also that would mean that fewer people are canceled, because we would have more competency before we sort of show up. We want to have some competency when we show up. And a lot of us, don't, like, some of us are overly confident and some of us are not confident enough. That's an interesting thing that I would argue.
But it's, I think what you're asking is not too much, simply just because, if I were to go give a keynote somewhere on a topic, I would practice it beforehand. I would not only not only in the mirror or whatever. And if I were to go, let's just, take it to anything that's even, if I want to go join the softball team, right, I'm going to go practice my pitches. I'm going to go practice batting. I'm going to go, I'm going to become familiar with the nomenclature and the terms. And, I'm going to watch it on TV. This, you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
So sort of, it's so it's not a big ask. It's not a big ask.
No, it's what we do in life. You're right. And, respect the game, respect what you're walking into, know that it has a huge history and a long litany of human experience in it, much of which will be new and challenging to you maybe, and challenging to your sense of self. But I mentioned earlier, not getting too fragile about it. Meaning when you hear about these things and you feel disturbed, you feel upset, you feel guilty, maybe ashamed that you're coming so late to the party, or that you may have in fact participated in things and not challenged them when you heard them. What matters to me is that you've woken up, right? To me, that's half the battle.
Sure.
And then if you can stay awake and then move into the practice, move into the riding the bike, falling off, riding, getting back up, and developing your resilience, and really sticking with it. I promise, this is one thing I say to leaders that I think makes a big difference. You will get better at this. It may feel tremendously awkward and unfamiliar, like you are speaking a different language that doesn't feel authentic to you. However, I think we learn by doing. Part of this is kinesthetic, right? Just the doing of it, right? The messing up, the way that you apologize when we mess up, it also matters. So prepare yourself to get it wrong. Let people know that you will. Be ready to apologize and mean it, and be very specific. And I would say, like, learn what you need to learn, and don't like take the hurt along for the ride. Because I think we can tend to do that because our ego gets really bruised when we don't get it right. And then we get angry, and then we get defensive, and then we take our marbles and go home and say, oh, well, that person didn't do right by me, and so I tried, No, sure. None of that. Like, this is not about that. It really calls on you to be so humble. And I think that in itself is one of the most beautiful sort of unexplored competencies of leadership that I think will behoove all of us and honestly equip us to thrive in the future.
Jennifer Brown, you are the author of How to Be an Inclusive Leader, soon to be the author of Coming In, I think, or calling in.
Who knows? Maybe it'll be a chapter, or I don't know yet. It's so
Thank you
exciting.
so much for the conversation today. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the e-learning podcast. If you like what you've learned today in this episode, I encourage you to either follow us or subscribe to us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And please do share this episode with one or two of your colleagues or friends. Also, I just want to remind you that you can level up your online learning game with all of the information that's available at the e-learning Success Summit. You can get your free ticket at elearningsuccesssummit.com. And finally, you can also stay up to date on everything that's important, all the news and the resources for e-learning professionals at lmspulse.com. Get our free newsletter by just going to lmspulse.com today. Thanks again.